Well, Remedy managed to create quite the mind-blowing experience with the release and subsequent success of Max Payne, and now the pressure was on to deliver something not just on par with the last game, but better. A task that would lead them into taking on Rockstar as a publisher. Now with a huge budget, the backing of an industry giant, and the intention of creating a work of art, Remedy made sure this next entry in the series will become a game that really meant something to the masses, and today we're going to find out whether or not they achieved that lofty goal. What's up guys, I'm Jared from Avalanche Reviews. Welcome to the Max Payne Retrospective. After the massive success of the first Max Payne, the existence of a sequel was all but guaranteed, and now that Remedy had established itself as a real force in the industry, the spotlight was shining brighter than ever, which was both a good and a bad thing. On the good side, a giant like Rockstar, who was still riding off the mainstream success of their PS2 Grand Theft Auto games, offered to publish the next Max Payne. On the bad side, the deal required Remedy to give up the rights to the series. Now, whether you think this was a good deal or not, you really can't fault the team at Remedy. This was their time to shine, and despite how well their first breakout success did, they still needed help if they were going to surpass it. The partnership with Rockstar meant access to a level of funds that dwarfed Max Payne's original production, and Remedy meant to see every penny of that money go straight into upping the quality of this planned sequel. Now, without a time machine, they couldn't have known that this would be the last time they touched the Max Payne intellectual property, but I'll be damned if they didn't go out with an atomic bomb-sized bang. At this point, Max Payne 2 was set up to make the first game look like an amateur affair, and nowhere was that more evident than the story.
What next? A kid with a bag full of guns and a head full of video games turns the house into a shooting gallery. Breaks my heart.
Writer of the first game and scrunch-faced poster boy Sam Lake got right to work on topping Max Payne 1 by taking everything good about the first story and increasing it by orders of magnitude. His goal was to focus even more on the film noir elements that made the original great and to really develop Max as a character. The goal from the very start was to write a tragic love story which really does speak to Max's cursed existence, but before we get into that, we should probably go over exactly what the story ended up being. 2 years after Max killed half of New York's criminal mobsters and a few high-ranking officials, he's back on the force. Now you'd figure that many bodies piled at a person's feet would lead to at least a little bit of jail time, but thanks to Alfred Woden, a wealthy politician who owed our guy more than a few favors, Max was given a full pardon. Now that Max had won the war he waged on the people responsible for the deaths of his wife and daughter, he just wanted to go back to work, a decision that would prove to be a bad one in the end. One rainy night, Max gets a call about gunshots coming from a factory. As the first guy on the scene, Max gets wrapped up with a group of professional hitmen masquerading as a cleaning company, a plot element that's way too damn smart for someone not to have tried it in the real world yet. After putting several holes in every jumpsuit-wearing punk in a mile-wide radius, Max gets the surprise of his life. It seems like not only did Mona Sachs survive the headshot she received in the first game, but she's also in the business of killing these cleaners. After failing to take any perps alive, Max is now on the odd case, and from here on, the road gets less and less straightforward. Old friends and enemies alike start to re-enter Max's life, and there's some shady stuff going on with the inner circle again. Max and Mona decide to tackle this issue with their trademark blunt force approach, and this leads to Max questioning his previous allegiances.
Easy.
Back off, Payne.
On one hand, there's his responsibility to uphold the law, and on the other is a woman that makes him feel alive again. The pulling from both of these aspects of his personality drives much of the story, and it helps this tale feel much more meaningful than the original. Sure, in the last game, Max was essentially driven by what happened to his family, but now he's haunted by it. He doesn't just lust for revenge anymore, he wallows in it.
Killing them all only made it worse. It didn't bring them back.
Hey, what are you, some kind of weirdo?
Sorry, this was...
He's an incredibly flawed hero, and throughout the game he can be found making terrible decisions thanks to his tendency to let his emotions blind him. Max Payne 2 is the dark tale of a guy who just can't let go of the past, and hell, sometimes it just doesn't let go of him. This isn't a tale of redemption like you would assume. It's a dark look at the long-term effects of exacting revenge and living with the guilt of not facing the consequences. Without a doubt, Max Payne 2's story is the absolute best part of the game, and as we'll see in a bit, that's really saying something. If you're a fan of dark narratives and modern film noir crime thrillers, you cannot waste another second not experiencing this incredibly bleak but satisfying tale. And if you've already dived into this moody plot and you think it can't affect you on an emotional scale anymore, well, I think Max said it best.
If you think nothing can get to you, you're lying to yourself. At best, you're temporarily dead. A lightning bolt can reanimate you without a warning.
Max Payne 2 is one of the best examples we have of a sequel that does exactly what it's supposed to do. Everything fun and functional from the first game is brought over and improved in some way or another. And that might sound like an obvious concept, but we so rarely see it in action, it just kinda has to be said. Just like its predecessor, MP2 is a third-person shooter which focuses on the conflicting ideas of fast-paced gunfights and stylish slow motion, but this time around all the knobs have been tweaked in the most satisfying ways possible. The difficulty of the first game has mostly remained intact, but this time around it feels much more fair and consistent. Just a few shots is still all it takes to put Max down, but thanks to some adjusted bullet physics, you're much less likely to take a random shot to the head from a sawed-off shotgun fired 8 city blocks away and pointed in a different direction. The adjustments to damage output and bullet spread makes engaging in real-time shootouts much more fun and way more of a viable option than before. Max's slow motion dive is as cool as it's ever been, but this time propels Max much higher into the air. One of my big issues with this move in part 1 was the fact that Max seemed to hover like 6 inches off the ground. This made for a much shorter dive and as a result, much less time spent in slow motion. This iteration of the dive is much more satisfying to pull off and gives you just a second more bullet time. The getting up animation will still put you in a bad situation if there's a few bad guys left standing after a dodge, but it seems to be just a tad shorter, or at least it feels that way. And this is about the right time to make a correction. In the first video of the Max Payne Retrospective, I said that activating bullet time was a pain, since if you were even slightly moving, it would just perform a dive instead. Well, it turns out the option to activate bullet time by itself is there, but for some reason that function is left unassigned by default, and since most of my experience with the series is with part 2, I was used to this being mapped to the right mouse button from the start. Well, needless to say, I was wrong in that video, but this layout does feel much more natural to me, and this meant I was able to pull off slow motion more organically instead of taking an extra millisecond to make sure I was at a dead stop. And since we're on the subject, there's been some pretty cool additions to this specific mechanic that makes for some of the most stylish combat you're likely to experience. Once bullet time is activated, the usual takes place. Time slows down and Max is able to move and aim just a bit faster than everyone else. But now time is slowed down for each enemy that's dispatched. This means kicking open a door and taking out 6 cleaners with a pair of Uzis will leave time nearly at a standstill, and I swear nothing looks cooler than this. The slower the bullet time, the slower the animations, which means the impact of your bullets are able to stack exponentially. Thanks to this, you can keep shooting the same guy and damn near send him into orbit, then move on to the next target, and once you've successfully sent each criminal assassin airborne, you can deactivate bullet time and watch their lifeless corpses hit the ground all at once. I can honestly say this is one of the most satisfying actions ever given to a gamer, and you're insane if you don't take advantage of it. Adding to the ever-increasing list of praise I'm showering on this game is the inclusion of the Havoc physics engine. Now, I know what you're thinking, how the hell is a physics engine going to make the gameplay in a third-person shooter better? Well, one issue with Max Payne was the fact that pre-baked death animations made it really hard to tell whether or not you had scored a kill, especially in slow motion. Thanks to the addition of ragdoll animations, you need no longer wonder. The instant an enemy dies, they are now at the mercy of your bullet physics, and this can make for some supremely entertaining side effects. For example, activating bullet time while an enemy is dodge rolling and shooting them in the air will not only blow him back, but the bullets will stack with his forward momentum from the dive. This sends these guys flying off in some random direction, and I swear it will never get old. In order to take advantage of the new mechanic, Remedy has set up several points in the game where bad guys are positioned to make full use of these new physics. Netting a kill here will result in some cinematic slow-mo and a zoom in on the glorious aftermath. Trust me, it's worth quick saving before any of these parts and trying for the coolest result possible. At least, that's what I do. Following in the vein of part 1, there's some light item fetching / puzzle solving elements to completing a level, but mostly, you'll be relying on your quick shooting and reflexes to get through this one. There have been some new guns added, and you can finally double fist the almighty Desert Eagle, which is immensely fun. There's also a few opportunities to play as Mona this time around, and even though there's no real difference other than some cool dodging options, it's awesome to finally see her in action. And speaking of changing things up, no conversation about MP2 is complete until the subject of mods comes up, and man, there is some serious quality to find in that department. Mods for Max Payne 2 can range from sound effect improvements, first-person modes, all the way to full-on game conversions. This right here is the Payne Evolution mod that essentially maps the full Max Payne 3 experience into 2's base game. Like most mods you're going to find, Evolution tweaks bullet time duration, the weapon roster, and even includes the last stand mechanic from 3 that let you cheat death if you could kill the person that dealt you the killing blow. Next up is Brutal Core++, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's a first-person mod that has some of the best gun sound effects I've ever heard in the game and cranked the difficulty up to 11. But instead of just throwing more enemies at you, Brutal Core makes you die the second any bullet touches you. This one is definitely for people looking for a dead serious challenge, but I think it's worth it. And lastly, the mod I'm most familiar with. The Cinema mod has been around since I was a teen, and this is the one I recommend the most. Even though Max's character model looks like a Matrix reject, the gameplay is supremely satisfying, and the increasing gore is just too cool to pass up. In the name of keeping that movie experience, clips of songs play when you enter bullet time, and oddly enough, thanks to this edition, this is how I was introduced to one of my favorite bands of all time, Typo Negative. But mods aside, I can say without a doubt, Part 2 is the definitive Max Payne experience. If the first game was a proof of concept, then this is the perfect form of that concept. Everything that made Part 1 interesting has been fine-tuned to a maniacal degree, and the overall gameplay has benefited greatly. It's actually kind of hard to describe, since after everything I would say, you could just chime in with, didn't Max Payne 1 do that? And yeah, technically it did, but Part 2 just feels so much better. The shooting and moving have fewer restrictions between them and the player, and it just flat out plays like a dream. I am of course willing to admit that I may be incredibly biased here though. Max Payne 2 is one of my favorite video games of all time, and I just can't imagine these mechanics working any differently. I do want to recommend that any of you guys new to the series start with the first game though. Not only is it awesome to experience the beginning of all these innovations, but it'll also help you fully appreciate all the improvements. Either way, this is the game that begs to be played, and no one is allowed to refer to themselves as a gamer until they have. That's an order. Max Payne 1 shook up the industry with its flat-out gorgeous presentation, driven just as much by budget constraints as it was by technical know-how. So it would be an understatement to say people were a bit excited to see what Remedy could do with the AAA giant backing them. And in a move that surprised absolutely no one, Max Payne 2 lived up to the rigorous standards its predecessor had erected. And the thing that really surprised me is the fact that this is all still taking place in the same engine used for Part 1. So they made some killer new additions, but these two games essentially share the same DNA. One shining new addition is fully articulating faces, where there were once 2D pictures of a scowl. Now cutscenes could take place in-engine, yet still convey all the nuance that would typically come from the graphic novel panels. Of course, these are still used, but man, it's nice to see Max talking and emoting with a real-life expression on his face. These in-game cutscenes follow the same cinematic flair that Remedy loves so much, and most of the time, just flat-out looks awesome. Just like Max Payne 1, there are a few really great widescreen patches if you're looking to fill your entire 16:9 monitor, but as you can see, I opted to get a more authentic 4:3 aspect ratio going. If you're interested in playing old PC games this way without stretching a low-res picture to 1080p, check the card in the corner for a tutorial on setting up custom 4:3 resolutions. As you probably noticed, this is the route I went with, and I couldn't be happier with the results. There's no question that this game looks incredible and blew me away back in the day when I first played it, but now replaying it, I can't help but admire it even more. Just like the first game, the use of real-world pictures being used as textures in the environment makes for a look that is aged like a fine wine. The believable layout of these backdrops are just as much of a focus as before, and this has always been one of my favorite tweaks to a game's presentation. Every apartment and backroom factory office you progress through will look true to life and really lived in. The city's dirty back alleyways are pleasingly dingy, and the layers of old graffiti feel true to the environment. If you'll remember, one of my favorite aspects about MP1 was the fact that New York felt like such a living, breathing place, and this is most certainly still the case. Looking out from some balcony high atop the city still gives me the feeling that I'm really there, and this is always something I look for in a game. Returning to the original are these TV shows that you can actually watch to completion. Just like the graphics, these little pieces of flair help immerse you into Max's world. No matter who's shooting at you or what mobster murder plot you're trying to foil, it's damn near impossible to walk into a room that has some lords and ladies playing and not finish the whole damn episode.
No! Do not drink, my lady!
Valentine, my lord!
Allow me!
Of course, Remedy knew improving on old techniques was a must, but they needed to come up with some new hotness if they were really going to up the ante, and that is precisely what they did. In a bid to increase the cool cinematic feel of Max's gunfights, Remedy implemented the Havoc's physics engine. Now enemies don't just activate some pre-baked animation on death. They ragdoll and react to both the environment and the ballistics of the weapon they're being shot with. And if running into a room and lifting someone in the air with a pair of Uzis doesn't sound like a good time to you, well, I'm sorry to hear about your medical condition that prevents you from experiencing fun. Like I said before, the graphic novel cutscenes have made a return, and this time Remedy saw fit to have professional actors play the game's roles. These scenes are of a much higher quality than the first game, and the effects used to make it look like hand-painted art are much more convincing. I've always been a fan of this stylistic choice, and it is definitely at its best here in Max Payne 2.
Right. And here I was thinking conspiracy theories had gone out of style.
The new actors do a great job of wearing their emotions on their face, and the overall composition of these bad boys shows that Remedy probably enlisted someone who creates comic books to contribute this time around. Now, without me telling you, you've probably already noticed how amazing this game looks despite its status as a senior citizen in game years, but there are some negatives worth mentioning, and as usual, this will be a list of things that very well may only exist in my head. The new animations are fluid as hell, and I'm glad to see their inclusion, but Max's run animation has always bugged me. He just bounces too much on every step, and it always reminds me of a cartoon character for some reason. Next up on the list is some scenes where it's obvious mocapping was used. Sometimes this just looks a little awkward. For example, check out this scene where Mona is supposed to be diving onto the floor in dramatic slow motion glory.
Found me. This was a mistake.
To me, it looked sort of weird since they just used the slow-mo to show her casually going to the ground. I can't tell you why, but scenes like this just stick out in my head as a bit of a bother. Lastly, the character models in this game still look great today, but they suffer from a condition I like to call Resident Evil hands. It seems like any character that's meant to be holding a gun during gameplay is just stuck with their hands in the gun-holding position during cutscenes. Now, there are different hand models since some scenes show their hands open, but it seems like they weren't able to articulate individual fingers, so these different hand models can't be changed mid-scene. And you know what, since we're already looking at this scene, it's always kind of bothered me that these cops meant to be shooting at the cleaner's van are just hitting the brick wall in front of them. Does that bother anybody else? Obviously, these don't amount to much of anything in the face of a game that looks drop-dead gorgeous, but if they're occupying space in my brain, I'll be damned if you're not going to suffer with me. Other than these nittiest of nitpicks, Max Payne 2 is a marvel to look at. While a keen eye might be able to see a little bit of Part 1's DNA in there, the new additions and much higher quality assets makes this one an absolute eye-catcher. But you know it's about time we cover that all-important subject, the game's ports, which this time around are a little bit less in number. Max Payne 2 was ported to the real contenders of its day, the Xbox and PS2. Sadly, no odd-ass GBA game this time, guys. But let's start off with the console that fared the worst last time, the PlayStation 2. I have my fingers crossed that Sony will redeem themselves here. Once again, we see the PS2 struggling to keep a steady frame rate, this time with the added bother of micro stutters. I will say that this PS2 version still wears the crown of the sharpest picture of the two, but I would definitely be willing to sacrifice a bit of that sharpness if the frame rate could be locked at a steady 30 FPS. If you guys watched the last video, you'll know that each console port changed the font in the graphic novel cutscenes, which was interesting for all the wrong reasons. But sadly, this isn't the case anymore. Textures seem to be very muddy, which looks pretty damn noticeable, or at least it was to me. Honestly, the PS2 has once again disappointed me. I figured that Rockstar, being so familiar with the hardware, could have put together something really cool with this port, but it looks like another zero-effort affair. I know Sony's Black Obelisk can't really compete with what was essentially a computer with a green X painted on it, but it still would have been nice to see the PS2 take home a win on this one. Oh well though, let's jump into the green team's effort and see what they have to offer. The Xbox version of Max Payne 2 has a lot of ups and downs, and that's mostly because I'm using the first game's port as a frame of reference, and that was a particularly great effort. On the plus side, this version runs at a cool 480p and targets 60 frames per second, but just like the last game's Xbox port, the video is much blurrier in the fine details. Sadly, the frame rate is not as rock solid as before. You'll see dips fairly often, and they can get in the way of gameplay in specific instances. Most of the time, you'll want to avoid large amounts of smoke since this is where the frames really start to tank. But to be honest, even this was a little nostalgic. The first time I ever played this game, it was on my family's Dell Dimension desktop, and I had just bought an ATI 9800 to get some solid performance out of Far Cry. Well, Max Payne 2 ran amazingly on that card, but it was the smoke that tripped it up when I had all the settings maxed out. So it was kind of cool to see that happen again. In that same old nostalgia-baked PC gaming vein, the loading times, while a little annoying, aren't that long at all. In fact, they last about as long as I remember them lasting on my crappy old 5400 RPM hard drive. On the more odd side of things, there were some really weird alterations in this version of the game. For some reason, this cutscene only has one cop instead of the normal two shooting at the van, and I got some really funky glitches, like this guy's face stretching a foot away from his actual head. But I guess the real question is, how does it play? And that's a bit of a downside as well. In the last video, I gave Max Payne's Xbox port high marks for controlling and running so well, but this time around, I had some issues with controlling Max. Much like Part 1's PS2 version, the right stick movement is very jumpy, but a little too slow, which is kind of hard to explain verbally. It's kind of like it takes a while to get the cursor where you want it, but once you get it moving, there's momentum and you can't exactly stop it on a dime. I am using a cheap knockoff controller though, so I'm not willing to rule that out as the cause. Of course, there's a good amount of auto aim, but it just doesn't help with how hard it is to center my reticle on an enemy's general vicinity. And back again with the weird stuff, I also noticed that the game's audio was very compressed sounding and maybe even a little overdriven. But the weird thing was, it seemed to be only with the low end, like Max's voice and some of the deeper sounding gunshot effects.
Right. And here I was thinking conspiracy theories had gone out of style.
Now, this wasn't exactly a bad experience for me, but I did have high expectations for this one, and it just didn't live up to them. It's still the best option on console, and I do appreciate the fact that there was a much more impressive game running on the same hardware, but it would have been nice to see performance on the same level as Part 1. But thanks to Daybreaker Rain, I have another platform to test, the Xbox 360. Since the launch of the 360, there were software updates made in order to make the console more backwards compatible with a pretty big number of original Xbox games, and luckily Max Payne 2 is on that list, so let's fire it up and see what we get. Right off the bat, you'll notice that the game defaults to 16:9, and it doesn't seem to be stretching the picture. This seems to be a legit widescreen mode, as demonstrated by the heads-up display not being stretched along with it. I have my 360 set to output 720p since I would rather have a lower resolution if it means getting progressive scan. And I'm not 100% how I feel about this picture. I mean, on one hand, it's a much softer picture than the Xbox, but the softness kind of looks okay. Now, as far as I understand it, the Xbox 360 essentially uses a software emulation solution for OG Xbox games, which would probably explain why it runs so weird. Sometimes on the 360 it runs better than the original, and sometimes it runs worse. But the thing I'm interested in is the upscaling. It's just kind of cool looking. Performance across the board is all over the place, and those of you who care about nitpicky stuff might notice that 480p does not evenly scale to 720, so do expect the shimmering, crawling pixels that comes with non-integer scaling. On the plus side, the audio issue seems to be way less noticeable, and the controls are much better, leading me to believe that it's definitely my Xbox controller causing the issues from before. Overall, I wouldn't say this is a recommended route to take, since you really can't count on this game performing consistently, but it's enough of a curiosity that you might have fun playing around with it like I did. And if you're looking to do a little comparing, here's each console port plus the 360 software emulation. The PS2 and Xbox ports are running on real hardware and being upscaled via my FrameMeister to 1080p. Once again, the PS2 takes the crown of sharpest picture, and while the Xbox version is softer on the edges, it runs much better. The 360 version is being internally upscaled to 720p and running in 16:9. It does add to the soft picture, but you can still make out sharper edges that comes with up-resing. Now, as far as gameplay is concerned, the Xbox version is definitely the way to go, but the 360's emulation is kind of interesting enough, you might just want to try it out. Alright, so it may be obvious at this point, but Max Payne 2 is a little more than a recommendation for me. This game is damn near perfection, and I honestly think anyone with the ability to should play this game. It stands as a testament to the art of storytelling in a video game, and while the fast-paced, adrenaline-pumping action doesn't mesh with the serious, dark, and interesting story, that dysphoria makes for one hell of an experience. You honestly aren't likely to come across many games with the level of polish you'll find here, and even fewer can match it in the meaningful plot department. No matter who you are or what you play on, Max Payne 2 needs to be on your list of completed games, and the sooner the better. You know, I often get caught up in the age-old argument, are video games art? And I typically side with the idea that they aren't. It's not to say anything bad about games, I just think that they're more entertaining than art can ever be. Now, I think entertainment still counts as expression, and it should be respected, or at least protected in the same way art is, but I will say this. If there was ever a game to convince me that this hobby of mine is indeed an art form, Max Payne 2 is that game. Honestly, this is one of the most replayable and enjoyable experiences I have ever had with a video game, and I sincerely hope that after this video you check it out for yourself. Trust me, you'll thank me later. Well guys, that's about it for today, but make sure to stay tuned. Next time we'll be checking out the first Max Payne title to be worked on outside of Remedy offices. But until then, I hope to see all of you again right here on the Max Payne Retrospective.
An army with her! Go get these men! Stop them! Everybody get your asses here! Everybody here! Stop them!
Thanks for swinging by, guys. This game really means a lot to me, so I hope I was able to convince some of you first-timers to check it out. If you like in-depth retrospectives like this one, I'll have some more linked on screen along with my Patreon. So if you want to ensure these videos keep kicking ass, feel free to check it out. The names scrolling on the screen have all thrown their support behind me, and I'm pretty sure that's why I've been able to accomplish so much. Well guys, I'm going to go ahead and get out of here, but thanks for watching, and I'll see you all next time.